I'm asking a question that puts God on the hook.
Right. No.
So my answer, and it's not emotionally satisfying, but I find it theologically satisfying, is that God does not save the individual Jew. He saves the Jewish people.
Yeah, well, I wonder, because I'm not denying at all the validity of what you said, but it seems to be the case in the biblical narrative that God portions out a pretty major responsibility and catastrophe for mankind, and that's to live ethically despite mortality and limitation. Right. It's a really heavy burden, and so then you wonder, it's like, well, just exactly how much are we called on to be ethical actors so that God's goodness can be revealed? And that's a real open question. And, when in Sodom and Gomorrah, when the search is on for one or two good men in the city so that it's not going to be destroyed, the idea there is that even if there's one person who's good, we won't destroy the city.
No, it goes down to 10.
Okay, 10.
No,
okay.
That's important.
Sorry, 10.
One doesn't suffice.
Okay, that's why we get him out and then everything falls apart.
Okay, but there's a notion there that
it's the outlier that saves every civilization.
Right.
It is the great lesson of our time. You're an outlier. It's a statement of fact, not even a compliment. It is a compliment, but it's not meant as such. Outliers do all the good that is done. Some outliers do evil. But all the good that is done by outliers.
Well, and that's the tension between the law and the law when it becomes corrupt, and the prophetic tradition that echoes through the Old Testament and then up into the New Testament too, because the law, from a tradition perspective, turns into various shades of Egypt, and then it's always a prophetic figure that comes up and shakes his fist and right in the face of the king. That happens most particularly in the case of David, right? When he's called on his sins because he takes Bathsheba, which is a really low act, right? I mean, he sees this woman bathing naked on the roof of a nearby house, and then he sends her husband, who's a great general, into battle to have him killed. It's like, that's pretty damn twisted and pathetic. And then one of the prophets, whose name I don't remember at the moment, calls him on it. It's
Nathan.
Is it Nathan?
No.
Yeah, which is pretty brave, right? I mean, he's a Mideast potentate. You don't just walk into his castle and tell him that he's cursed by God without some fear for your neck. And you see this just continually, this dichotomy between the corruption of tradition and the emergence of a prophetic figure who's in principle has this inspiration from God. And the weight of his words is what indicates that that's the case.
Dennis, you didn't quite say it, and I would never dare say it as a Christian, but I've heard Jews say that one reason for the question you raised was the Israel. And Israel's now a nation recognized by the world.
You've heard that one? I've heard it all of my life, and I have to say that it depicts God, to my way of thinking, in an awful way.
The ends don't justify the means.
Well, ends do sometimes justify means, but yes, we murdered 1 million Jewish babies, and we tortured and humiliated and degraded 5 million others in order to produce Israel. I as a Jew would say, I think I'm going to opt for another group.
Yeah.
That was Ivan's comment. That is not the God that I understand.
Yeah, that's Ivan's comment in the Brothers Karamazov too, when he takes on Alyosha. He said his point, in some sense, he talks about this girl who's frozen to death by her parents as she's screaming in an outhouse, which is a story that Dostoevsky took from the news. It's actually happened. So she screamed all night, froze to death, and Ivan says he can't believe in a God that would allow that to happen even once, no matter what the reason was.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I believe in a God who allows evil to happen. That's not what you were challenging. God created the evil to do the good of the creation of Israel. That I don't accept. No. That God allows evil is a given.
Yeah, well, it's a consequence of free will.
Yes,
in some
exactly.
Real sense.
Yes.
I thought about that a lot too, because you could imagine a world that's the best world possible, just as a game in some sense. Not that we can really do that, but then you might ask yourself, is a world where you could choose evil but choose not to better than a world where you're a robot who has no choice? And I think the answer to that, I mean, if you think about your own children, you want this vast expanse of possibility for them. And the vaster that expanse of possibility, the more real the possibility of evil choices is. But what they get out of that is the benefit of the actual choice. So they have a real destiny, right? They're wrestling with real things, and they can choose not to engage in evil. So it could be not there. Although if it's going to exist in real possibility, it also has to be an actualizable possibility. And so it could be that a world where evil is possible, but then not chosen, is better than a world where evil doesn't exist at all.
That's why I've always been suspicious of people saying about a dog, such a good dog. Has he chosen his goodness?
Yeah, surely a world in which there's a possibility of doing good and bringing about, generating value is a world that is better than a world in which that's simply not possible at all.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And in some sense, that's the fundamental question, because it's one thing to wrestle with the reality of tragedy, but it's a whole different thing to wrestle with the reality of malevolence. And you might say, well, why would God create a world where the snake in the garden, let's say, why would God allow a world where evil existed to exist as a possibility? And it could be easily that the good that is there as a consequence of the breadth of possibility supersedes the evil of the possibility of malevolence. Plus, it also gives people some real thing to wrestle with, right? Is that whatever human beings are, we have a heavy load. It's a load that in Christianity is associated in some sense with divinity, right? Because God becomes mortal man. And so it's a real, what we're contending with is real in the most fundamental sense, and that means it's not trivial. We can get into real trouble. And of course, the Holocaust, that was real trouble. And so that's also, it's a very peculiar idea, but it's also some evidence of the, respect that whatever created us has for us, that we actually have a real destiny, and in the broadest possible sense.
I suppose you can say that it's just not possible to bring about a world in which benevolence is possible, where there isn't a genuine risk of malevolence as well.
Well, maybe it's not possible. It may be, but so then you might think that the optimal solution is where great evil is possible but freely rejected. And that would be the best of all possible worlds. And I do believe that's the case. And I certainly see this is part of the Jungian idea of incorporating the shadow, I suppose, which is also that this capacity that we have within us, which is a predatory capacity, this capacity for great evil and for brutality and for strength, all of that makes us much more than we would be if we can harness that for good than we would be if we were just harmless rabbits, for example. Not to denigrate rabbits, they're perfectly lovely, but you get the picture. And the best people I know have been the people who, have absolute capacity for mayhem if unleashed, but choose not to unleash it, in fact, to harness it for purposes of the good. So, now, Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Another indication of him being subservient to an ethical structure outside both the Egyptian and the Hebrew structure there, because he's serving this priest of Midian and tending his flock. That also makes Moses a figure that transcends the parochial confines of his culture, another indication of that. And he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And so God here is associated with the mountain, and so you could riff on that. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire, this compelling and attractive fire phenomenon, out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses...
That's the symbol Jews often use for the Jewish people. We're always burned, but we're not consumed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the question is, in a situation like that, just exactly what's being burned away. One of the reasons that the transcendent is terrifying and why people purified themselves, for example, before they engaged in psychedelic experiences historically, was because if they got too close to the fire, the burning that produced was so intense that it might be of mortal danger. If you're 95% dead wood and you get too close to the fire, all that dead wood should go, but it might be fatal. So,
you were mentioning the whole heroic side of faith, or I think you were, in fact. There's also this terrifying aspect of the deity linked to transcendence and the absoluteness, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, as Otto described it. This mystery that is both repelling because it's terrifying and at the same time attractive. And I think that was obviously...
Well, we get some echoes of that, I would say, in contact with things of great beauty. The European cathedrals are like that. I was in one in Vienna recently that had 3 floors of plague bones underneath it. And so it's this magnificent structure, too much really, when you walk in, and it's overwhelming in its power. And to see that, people sacrificed hundreds of years of effort under conditions of extreme privation to build these magnificent buildings, and then to go underneath and see the layers and layers and layers of catastrophe and death that's been erected on. It's too much, right? It's just too much. And that's just an echo of what is too much in the most fundamentally absolute sense. It's just a pointer in that direction. People are terrified of beauty for the same reason. I've watched people respond to art. I had a lot of paintings in my house at one point. They're all coming back now. Like 300 of them, it was just paintings everywhere. And people would come in and say, well, why would you want to live in a museum? And I'd think, well, that's exactly where I want to live. Why would you not want to live? But it was too much. The paintings, a lot of them were paintings of warfare scenes, and they were beautiful, but they weren't nice. It wasn't elevator music, and you look at those things and they shake all the weakness off of you if you look at them long enough. And that's very frightening, especially if there's lots of weakness, and there definitely is.
So it's interesting, is it not, that in our culture, where you might say there's been a systematic ideological process of desecration, that there's also been an aversion to beauty.
That's not accidental.
The philosopher Roger Scruton.
Generica, right?
Yeah,
the spread of, exactly, the spread of these cookie-cutter suburbs everywhere that have this they're efficient in some sense, and they're convenient, but they're just hideous. And they have this very short-term element. And you see this contempt for that too. It's really terrifying to see it in Europe, because as a North American, especially Canadian, going to Europe has this element of pilgrimage to beauty. And I saw this in Edinburgh in particular, although they're fixing it. Edinburgh, the whole downtown core, 1 square mile, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and no wonder, because Edinburgh is it's beautiful. And then intermingled with these mostly Victorian buildings, if I remember correctly, were these hideous catastrophes erected in the 1970s, this brutalist, modernist abortion, these giant middle fingers, to the entire context. And to their credit, the people of Edinburgh are tearing them down. And
my mentor, Peter Berger, has a notion, signals of transcendence. Some are positive, beauty, or C.S. Lewis, surprised by joy. Some are negative, like the Auden one. This, to me, is the ultimate signal of transcendence ever. Because if you look at burning, it must end in ashes.
Anything you can't look away from fire either.
Nothing lasts. Everything changes. You can't step in the same river twice. You just go that way, you'd end up with a Hindu view of Maya, and the world's unreal. And yet, no, here's something burning, but not burned up.
Right, that's us, man.
No, there's something beyond us, and he's arrested. He sees it, and then he seeks for the explanation, and immediately he encounters the Lord. And that's why, Dennis, the Jews themselves are the ultimate, because of your survival. Despite persecution, you shouldn't be here.
Some shouldn't. Just forgive me. I
now you're in trouble. Now you're in trouble.
I'm thinking of Trotsky and the like. There's some
Well, to jump
unimpressive Jews.
To jump from the Hebraic to the Hellenic, that's not far off the way Plato uses the image of fire in his famous image of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic. The flames are flickering, But that's not all there is. There's transcendence beyond. There's the sunlight, the stable, timeless sunlight outside the cave, which the sort of chaotic fire of the sensory world and the fickle world, the ever-changing world, but it's a signal of transcendence, as Berger puts it. And it's an interesting sort of consonance there.
Well, fire is also this mysterium tremendum and fascinans that you described, because I think biologically, and I'll think about this from an evolutionary perspective, we're all descendants of the first proto-human chimpanzee analog who absolutely 100% could not stop looking at fire. Right? And fire is absolutely fascinating to human beings. It's so interesting to watch people around a campfire, for example, where we feel at home. We gaze into the fire, and the fire seems to me to be something that escapes what's called latent inhibition, is that almost everything we see after we've seen it multiple times, we see as a representation of memory. We don't see the thing itself, but fire is one of those things that escapes that, and we see fire as something that's constantly new, plus it's always constantly changing, and we cannot look away from it, just like we can't look away from little children, and we can't look away from sexual beauty. These things all escape the tyranny of our conceptualization. So
I just wanted to say something about these two. To me, these two texts, the one you read before and this one, is really one of the most, a very beautiful description of reality, based a little bit on what you were saying before. Because it says, and God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. First of all, this is also referring to Genesis at the end of the flood, because that's how the flood ends. The flood ends, it says, God remembered Noah. And when God remembers Noah, the waters recede, and then the dove finds the tree, finds the structure that connects heaven and earth. That's what the dove finds. And so you have this verse, but right there it says, he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for the first time, you have this hierarchy again coming back, saying God is already giving back the identity to his people. He's already saying, it's like it's not just God and chaos. There's this whole story that's there, and he's going to give it back to his people. And then when Moses, so
is that Jacob's ladder? Do you think is that the
definitely?
Same
It's definitely Jacob's ladder, the mountain, and the tabernacle itself. When we get to the tabernacle, you'll see it's a representation of Moses' mountain itself, or the mountain of paradise itself. So then Moses, right after that, you have Moses. What happens? He comes out of the desert, come to a mountain, and in that mountain now he sees this flaming bush. He has to remove his sandals. He enters into the sacred space. The sacred space is the text. At least I know St. Gregory of Nyssa really insists on how the bush is a bramble bush. It's a thorn bush, and that's you can see that's the fullness of everything, because the thorns are the consequence of the fall. The thorns are what God gives as a consequence of sin. And now here is this thorn bush, which is full of light, but is not consumed. And that's the thing. That's what God gives us. It's like reality can exist in all its multiplicity, in all its beauty. And we don't, as Christians and people also in the Hebrew tradition, we don't have this idea that the world is an illusion, that the world is just has to be gotten rid of, and we just need to get to nirvana or whatever. We have this sense that the world is full of God's presence, and it's a gift, right? It's good. That's what it says at the beginning of Genesis. I think that's what we're seeing here, is this God is present in the world. God is manifesting himself to Moses, but he's not consuming it. It's continuously continuing to exist even in its participation in God.
And I read that so Moses has to take his sandals off to go to do this. I read that that's also his, and this is on commentary on the Torah, that he was foregoing any claim to ownership of the land upon which he stood. There were ancient Hebrew traditions about taking ownership of land that had to do with being shod. And so to take off the shoes meant to approach the transcendent in a humble way with no claim to possession. And that seems to me, and the shoes, of course, are symbols of identity. Tammy, my wife, she had dreams all the time where shoes represented her current identity. And so, all right. And the angel of Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. This is at least a great mystery. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place
By the way,
whereon...
the only redundancy in God's entire dialogue in the Bible
is...
take your shoes off your feet.
And so
Just
why...
a cute, meaningless point, but I've always gotten a kick out of it. Else are your shoes if not on your feet?
From off thy feet.
Yeah.
Like, where else?
Right. Just to take off your shoes would have sufficed.
Is that in the Hebrew?
Yes. Yes. It struck me as a kid. Where else are his shoes? I don't.
Well, it also means, I think, that God is insisting that in some real sense, Moses stands unprotected and naked in front of him. And because to take off your shoes is, and to reveal your feet, that might account for why that emphasis is there, right? And so it's the feet and not the shoes. And the shoes are definitely, they're a fundamental element of culture. And they shield us from our contact with the ground, but they also, in some real sense, elevate us above the ground, right? That's the danger of shoes. We're no longer in contact with the earth. There's a lack of humility by putting on those garments of skin, and we feel invulnerable in a way that we really want.
I think the best way to understand this text is as a return to Eden. Mm-hmm. And so in order to return to Eden, he has to remove his garments of skin. Mm-hmm. And it's like, but what's crazy is the surprise. It's like he removes his garments of skin, and the surprise is to see the thorn bush in flame. It's like, what a crazy mystery. Like, what a...
Well, and that's an echo then too of the notion that in order to encounter the transcendent in the most real sense, you have to absolutely at 100% accept your naked vulnerability. And you think, well, that's self-evident when you think it through, because how else could you adapt to life in the most fundamental sense without simultaneously... accepting the fact that you're ultimately, naked and vulnerable. Mm. You're ultimately that, because you're prone to insanity, you're prone to tyranny, and you're prone to death. There isn't any more ultimate on the human plane than that. And so if you can't adapt to that and accept it, then you can't adapt to or accept life. So
You think that's a big reason, any of you, why so many people have rejected God? They're not prepared to accept their vulnerability?
yes.
I don't know. I'm truly asking.